this very important issue. And I welcome all of our witnesses today, and particularly want to thank Mr. Zakheim. Did I pronounce your name correctly? All right. Thank you. And Ms. Shinazi, as well as the other members of the Commission on Wartime Contracting for their important work, their tireless efforts, and this is a final report that I think not only members of this committee, but every member of Congress should read. So I really appreciate your work, and certainly appreciate General Bash and Secretary Kendall being here today to talk about this report. The Commission on Wartime Contracting is an independent bipartisan commission, as the chairman mentioned, created by Congress in 2008, and this final report represents the culmination of tremendous work that has consisted of extensive research, hearings, meetings, and the work of professional staff stationed full-time in Baghdad and Kabul. And I congratulate the Commission on this report. I believe getting contingency contracting right is particularly important for two primary reasons. First, ensuring mission success and supporting our warfighters in Afghanistan and Iraq demand no less that we get this right. Sufficient oversight of contracting may be decisive in determining the outcome in Afghanistan and Iraq. As General Petraeus said in his September 2010 counterinsurgency contracting guidance, the scale of our contracting efforts in Afghanistan represents both an opportunity and a danger. With proper oversight, contracting can spur economic development and support the Afghan government's and ISAF's campaign objectives. If, however, we spend large quantities of international contracting funds quickly and with insufficient oversight, it is likely that some of those funds will unintentionally fuel corruption, finance insurgent organizations, strengthen criminal patronage networks, and undermine our efforts in Afghanistan. I could not agree more. It is often said that contingency contracting is the most powerful non-kinetic weapon on the battlefield, especially in a counterinsurgency campaign. We must not haphazardly, obliviously, or hastily contract. Doing so can result in taxpayer money ending up in the hands of our enemies. It is unacceptable for $1 of ours and our taxpayer dollars to end up in the hands of our enemies, and that's why this is so important. That's why Senator Brown and I introduced legislation earlier this year called No Contracting with the Enemy, and we need to make sure that it is easier for U.S. contracting officials to get out of contracts with contractors who funnel taxpayer resources to the enemies of the United States. Contracting in Kandahar in a war should not be treated the same as contracting in Fort Hood, Texas in peacetime. I'm pleased that key provisions of our No Contracting with the Enemy legislation were included in the National Defense Authorization passed by the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I would also note that this legislation hasn't been brought to the floor yet, and I'm very hopeful and was encouraged by the Majority Leader's statement 2 days ago that he was going to bring forward the defense authorization to the floor. I think this is just one provision in it that's so important to getting that defense authorization passed. The success of our contracting must be viewed through the metric of how well it supports our campaign objectives and the mission outcome. Contracting must be thoroughly integrated into all intelligence planning and operations. Contingency contracting must not be viewed as a separate logistical activity. As General Petraeus said, contingency contracting is fundamentally, quote, commander's business. While General Petraeus probably had ISAF commanders in mind, I would include the leadership at the Pentagon, the State Department, and USAID in that statement as well. Our DoD witnesses, as well as their counterparts at the State Department and at USAID, I am sure will agree that oversight of contingency contracting is a major, not a peripheral, part of their responsibilities. The second reason contingency contracting, and it certainly doesn't come secondary to the first reason I talked about, is because of we are at war and we're in a time of fiscal austerity. We can't afford to waste a single dollar as we seek to give our troops the resources that they need. Every dollar wasted or spent inefficiently diverts resources away from our mission and from protecting our country. As ranking member of this subcommittee and also as the spouse of a veteran, I'm not going to sit by idly, and I know that the chairman isn't either, and allow this to continue to happen. For these reasons, I believe we must engage in a serious and ongoing discussion to understand the current challenges and the best way to address them. However, let me be clear. I don't want to sit around and admire the problem. The Commission has concluded that between $31 and $60 billion of taxpayer funds have been lost to contract waste and fraud in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's outrageous. If this is accurate, and I think given the thorough work that was done by this Commission, it's very accurate, we need to implement the appropriate reforms without delay, with a real sense of urgency. In order to help catalyze these efforts and to build on the excellent work of the Commission, yesterday I was proud to join Senator McCaskill and Senator Webb in sending a letter to the Comptroller General asking GAO to assess the actions of the Department of Defense and State as well as USAID in response to the findings and recommendations of the Commission. We need to clearly understand what the departments are doing to implement the Commission's recommendations right now, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses on that issue today. When there are areas of disagreement with the Commission's recommendations, perhaps related to the right to appeal and the establishment of a Joint Staff J-10 element, I want to hear from the Department of Defense and the Department of State and USAID why they disagree and why they don't believe that those recommendations should be implemented. And I think the onus is on the Department of Defense and certainly the Secretary of State's office to tell us why shouldn't we implement them. I think today's hearing will be an important part of the effort to ensure that we're conducting proper oversight of contingency contracting for the troops, the taxpayers. Everyone deserves nothing less. Before I conclude, allow me to make a brief and related comment regarding Iraq. Over the weekend, there were reports suggesting that all U.S. troops would leave Iraq by the end of the year. While Iraq is a sovereign country and immunity for our troops is absolutely essential, and I certainly agree with the administration on that, I believe such a hasty departure may endanger a successful outcome in Iraq that has been made possible with the ultimate sacrifice of over 4,400 Americans. In addition, the precipitous withdrawal of almost all U.S. troops by the end of the year will almost certainly invite a new and dangerous round of problems related to contracting. The Department of State transition into Iraq as U.S. troops almost completely withdraw simply cannot independently acquire and oversee the scale and nature of contracted services that will be required, and that's a real issue and concern I think needs to be addressed right away. While the State Department intends to rely on the Department of Defense for help, the pace and extent of the administration's plan to withdraw the military and transition the State Department into Iraq will expose the U.S. to risk that taxpayer dollars in support of the State Department's diplomatic mission in Iraq will be lost due to the same concerns, waste, fraud, and abuse. And perhaps critically, that much of the progress that our servicemen and women achieved to help stabilize and rebuild Iraq could be endangered. I'm very troubled by this, and I am hopeful that we will also address this issue today, and I'm going to continue to press for answers on this. I also look forward to a discussion during today's hearing related to DoD's investment in building facilities in support of the military mission that the host governments will simply not be able to sustain. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses on these important issues, and again, I thank you so much, Madam Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and I thank the witnesses for being here.
Thank you, Senator. We'll begin our testimony with Lieutenant General Brooke Spash.
Secretary Kendall, that you and I spoke before this meeting. We met, and I asked you about the provisions from Senator Brown and I's legislation on no contracting with the enemy that got included in the NDAA. Do you think those are important, and will they be helpful?
Yes, we do support those, Senator. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
I appreciate that. And then wanted to ask about, in particular, this issue for Mr. Zakheim and Ms. Shinazi about where we're going in Iraq. Because in connection with the effort to transition operations in Iraq from the Department of Defense to the Department of State, the State Department will need to hire, what I've heard, potentially thousands of contractors to provide for some of the things are medical, basic support, security, because we're only, if I take the latest announcement to be the case, only a very minimal amount of military security. And basically what I'm hearing for a number is of the 16 to 17,000 personnel that may ultimately make up the State Department's presence in Iraq, about 14,000 of them could be contractors. So I would like to hear from both of you, what concerns do you have about that happening and the degree to which the Department of State will rely on contractors in Iraq? What concerns you think that arises? Because I also see a very significant discussion here with the Department of Defense, but will there be any type of transition from the lessons we're learning here and we're talking about today on adequate oversight and contracting over to the state side? And how will that all, I just would love to get your observations on it. And then, of course, if General Bash and Secretary Kendall have any observations, I would just hate to see us do this and then pour billions of taxpayer, I don't know what the number will be, taxpayer dollars back in there and have all these lessons just kind of fly out the window.
Well, I do have tremendous concerns. I have more concerns, unfortunately, than I have answers. Clearly, if the State Department, until now, has had trouble managing its contracts, and there's no question that it's had some, I don't know how it's going to manage all of this. One thing that concerns me and that can be dealt with, it's my understanding that the State Department believes that when the government has now stated that risk should be accounted for in considering contracting, and that that security is an inherently governmental problem, that does not apply to the State Department, simply because State says we're not into the business of fighting, and therefore whatever we're doing is not inherently governmental. Now, clearly, if you've got a whole bunch of contractors out there with guns who will be doing all sorts of things, to me, to my simple mind, that is something that involves security and that is inherently governmental. So I think it's very, very important that State adopt the same risk kind of approach that DOD appears to be adopting, which is don't send them out there if it's a high-risk project, because then you're going to have a bunch of contractors either being shot at or shooting at Iraqis. And that's just not going to be a very good thing. And that's a disaster waiting to happen. So that's one possible thing that maybe even could be legislated. I don't know. The other is simply to get more oversight. And if State has to beg, borrow, and steal people from other agencies, well, why not? That's doable. Part of the problem is that unfortunately, many of our civil servants, certainly outside DOD, are just not willing to deploy. It's all voluntary. And so we have a problem there, too. I mean, when I was in government, I often felt that there were 2.5 agencies fighting this war. DOD was fighting this war, State was fighting this war, and you added up all the others, and there was another half agency all combined. Well, our country's at war. Mm-hmm. And every civil servant who has something to contribute out there ought to be told you're going. That could be something that could help State as well.
Thank you.
Please. To add just something, the State Department, in responding to recommendations in our interim report, made the case that they felt that their model for contracting and overseeing contractors was sufficient. They knew how to operate in an international environment. They contracted all the time. They knew what they were doing, and so they pushed back on a number of our recommendations. We would argue that we've seen enough poor outcomes from State Department contracting that we were not in agreement with their assessment of that. What you have seen, which brings me to the point of, is the problem being addressed? And the Commission put out 2 special reports on this. The issue has been on the table for over a year. It doesn't seem to be much closer to resolution. The State Department has not moved to solve the problem. The Defense Department has offered the use of the log cap contract for some of the operations, but the State Department has not trained up its contracting officials sufficiently to be able to make good use of that log cap contract. I think what you will see is a diminishment of what the State Department says is required for its operations in Iraq. As you probably know, they've cut down on the number of locations where they said they would be able to operate. that is, possibly going to go down and down and down to the point where they can actually match what their resources are to a requirement set, and I don't think that's been done yet. So I share Commissioner Zakheim's concern that we're going to be ready to do this when the time comes.
Thank you, and I certainly want to hear from General Bash and Secretary Kendall about this, but before I do that, I just want to have one follow-up to what you said, Ms. Genazi, which is, I'm new to this place. I'm a new senator, and have we done the same type of analysis that you just did, which was phenomenal and is going to be very helpful in guiding policy decisions, and obviously Department of Defense is here before us taking this very seriously with state?
The analysis of whether or not...
Right. I mean, the contracting analysis that we're doing here.
State's part of this report.
Okay.
We because this is an Armed Services Subcommittee, we focused on DOD, but let me make it clear. Our report addresses state and AID. We had testimony from senior officials in both agencies.
But one of the concerns I have is just from what Ms. Genazi just said, that we didn't get the full response from state that you got from DOD.
I think that's
And
accurate.
that seems to me, then how can we have a full picture of state? Now, I know state's mentioned in this report that you've talked to those officials, USAID, but is there more work that we need to do on that end?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate
In
that.
fact, I would say a lot more work.
Okay. And I'm sorry, Secretary Kendall and General Bash.
I could go on for hours about the transition in Iraq because I'm the senior DOD official who's been working that problem with the State Department. My counterpart's been Undersecretary Pat Kennedy at State, who's their Undersecretary for Management. I've made 3 trips to Iraq as part of examining progress and getting ready for the transition. There is a lot of risk in the transition, and I'll let the State Department address that, but I could talk directly to the contracting concerns. The DOD is basically providing the contracting support to State Department for all of its essential functions. We're transferring thousands of pieces of equipment to State Department. We've worked hand in glove with them on the sites that have already now nominally been transitioned to their initial control. They're keeping 11 sites, roughly, I think 5 of those, that we will still be operating under the Chief of Mission stature for operation, for security cooperation in Iraq. We are providing the LOGCAP 4 contract support to them. That was awarded recently. There was a protest, which was not successful. That's in place. There are contracts in place for security. There are contracts in place for fuel delivery and other supply delivery. Defense Logistic Agency is supporting the State Department. The plan is that we would essentially, through our organizations, particularly the Army Contracting Command, administer these contracts from the stateside perspective at least, through 2012. At that point, state would hopefully be ready to transition over to direct administration themselves. If they're not, we are prepared to continue that support. Now, most of the oversight in country would be provided by State Department people, and they need to train their people up to do that. That's in progress. So I think I started on this a year ago, roughly. At that point in time, we were nowhere in terms of getting ready for this transition. But I think today we are in decent shape. We are ready to transition to state. The contracts are in place that they need. I'm sure there will be problems. There have to be with the transition. The State Department has never done anything this big, even though they've had a reasonable amount of experience at smaller scale. A lot of the projects I think that the Commission looked at were USAID projects and infrastructure projects and so on. That doesn't apply here. This is essentially base operations. The 17,000 or 16,000 figure that you mentioned is approximately correct. They are mostly contractors. A good fraction of them are private security contractors who will mostly be doing static security. They'll be providing protection on the bases because we will not be there. The military will not be there. There will be a small Marine contingent for the embassy and some other locations, but generally security will be provided by private security contractors, mostly static security. There will be some security also for people when they go outside and do whatever they have to do outside of the bases. The Iraqi security forces are also supposed to be providing security for our people that are there as part of the mission. But that's not immediate direct security of the facilities. That will be provided through private security contractors primarily. There's risk in this, but I can tell you that from the contracting perspective, I think we're in pretty good shape to make the transition.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, for our people, I can understand why they might not want to go now, even some of the civilian personnel, if that's what we're going to rely on for security.
Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I